All right, good morning. I think we're going to go ahead and start our webinar here. You have our full team ready to share with you our results of a project that we've been working on for about a year and a half about disabled wildlife viewers. Thanks so much for joining us. Great to see such a big crowd here today. We already have 85 folks joining us online, and we're looking forward to spending this time with you. I'd like to start by turning it over to Shelley Plant, who is our awesome lead collaborator from the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group, who will give a short introduction before we get started.
Hi, all. Welcome. I'm Shelley Plant. I'm with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, but more broadly, I chair the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and we have been lucky enough to be partnering with Ashley Dare and her team at the Dare Lab in Virginia Tech over the past 5 years on a series of multi-state conservation grants to get to know wildlife viewers better, what their needs are, how we can better work with them, accommodate them, facilitate their interaction with the outdoors. And today you're going to learn the findings of the most recent multi-state conservation grant, where focus groups were done by the Virginia Tech Lab with wildlife viewers who have disabilities of some sort. And we're going to learn all about ways that we can help engage with a different public and make it easier for everyone to participate in the outdoors. So thanks for coming. I'm glad you're here. I'm going to pass it back to Freya, Ashley, and Emily.
All right, thanks so much, Shelley. Great to have you here as well. So a little bit of introduction of our team. We have Emily Singular, who recently received her PhD from Virginia Tech. She has been working with us for all of these projects, so she's now Dr. Singular. So big congrats to Emily on that. She'll be fledging later this week, which we are also sad about, but fortunately will be staying in the field and also will still be at Virginia Tech working in another lab as a postdoctoral associate. Also have Freya McGregor joining us. Freya's been an awesome addition to our team with her occupational therapy background, bringing a lot of practical insights about how to work with a disabled audience of wildlife viewers. And we've been excited to work with her and continue to work with her, which you'll hear a little bit more about our ongoing work at the end. And then finally, I'm Ashley Dare. I'm an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation. My work focuses on conservation social science, thinking about how to engage people related to wildlife conservation, and then also the benefits of wildlife recreation to people. Okay, just briefly before we get started, I wanted to mention one more thing. All of us have experience either in the past or currently with accessibility challenges. That said, we don't have the full range of experience with accessibility challenges ourselves, so we're looking forward to do the best job that we can sharing the insights of people that we have met with, and we hope that that will be useful for you here today. We're interested to know who's on the line. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your title, your organization, maybe of your favorite animal to wildlife watch, that would be great so we get a sense of who our audience is today. And so you can type that into the chat. As you're doing that, I wanted to make just a couple other housekeeping announcements. One is if you have questions for Freya, Emily, myself, or Shelley that we can answer at the end or along the way via chat, please feel free to drop them into the chat. Additionally, I wanted to let you know that you could hit the show captions option on the bottom of your screen if it would be helpful to you to be able to see the transcript as we go through the presentation as well. Awesome to see you all. I'm putting down your introductions in the chat. Looks like we have folks from all over across all the states, folks who do work related to disabilities, folks who do work related to wildlife viewing, others who work for state agencies, and even those who aren't with state agencies. So thanks so much for sharing that. We'll scroll through it when we're not the ones presenting, so we have a sense of who we're talking to. So today's a really exciting day. Not only is there a webinar, but we've also finished off and have uploaded online just this morning the final version of this report that goes along with the webinar that you'll be seeing here today. So you all are going to be the first to know about it. We will share with you the link to that report. It's in the chat right now, which will probably get buried, but it will also come back and be in the chat at the end of the presentation. Additionally, you'll get a link to it and a release about it probably tomorrow. So please do share that with others. We're hoping that today will just whet your appetite for the whole array of findings that are in there. And we'll also share a recording of this presentation if you prefer to share that with others as well as a way for them to learn more about what's in the report. And then finally, in terms of what we have planned today, we're going to give a little background on our project, how we got to where we are. And then as Shelley said, our focus is on these focus group findings that we had. And the insights help us understand who are the people who support wildlife viewing, what can be done to make wildlife viewing programs more accessible, how can wildlife viewing locations be more accessible, how can people in organizations or individually provide allyship to people who are disabled or neurodivergent? And then general recommendations for agencies that we came up with, co-produced with a group of people from state agencies who shared or who heard our results and thought about how those could be applicable to state agencies based upon their experience working with state agencies. And then finally, we'll share what's next, what's our current work that we have underway, and what you might expect to see from us in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily and Freya, who will be sharing this presentation with you. They have led this project together for the last year and a half as an awesome team, and I hope you enjoy today's presentation. Take it away, Emily.
Um, it's my turn actually. So hi everyone.
Just kidding. Take it away, Freya.
As Ashley mentioned, my name's Freya McGregor. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a research associate in the DARE Lab. I'm also a disabled wildlife viewer. And you probably have an idea, but just so we're all on the same page, that we're using this definition of wildlife viewing that the US Fish and Wildlife Service use, which is closely observing, feeding, and photographing wildlife, visiting parks or natural areas to observe, feed, or photograph wildlife, and maintaining plantings and natural areas for the benefit of wildlife. So this, as Shelley mentioned, this project is part of a string of projects that we have been conducting in collaboration with the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group. The first project funded by a Multistate Conservation Grant was a national survey of wildlife viewers, just trying to understand what people were up to, how they engage in wildlife viewing, were there regional differences, and that the finding for the report for that is available online on our website, which we will share with you over and over again today. The following year, we dove further into those findings to understand more about the differences between rural wildlife viewers and urban wildlife viewers and how they overlapped and how our state wildlife agencies could best serve those two different populations. And then this project that you're going to hear about today built on those, and we dove right into discussing and learning more about disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. So if you've been with us for a while, last spring we did 2 webinars. One of them was about the literature review. So we dug into a whole lot of research, guidelines, best practices, and consolidated all of those into a document to help us understand what we do know about disabled wildlife viewers. That literature review is available on our website. And today is the end of this phase of this project, but we've got more coming. So if you would like to know more about any of these things, you can visit our website. It is viewing.fishwild.vt.edu. At the top of that page, you'll see Disabled Wildlife Viewers. Click on that button and you'll find all of the resources about the disabled wildlife viewers. Those other projects are also on that webpage as well, including the literature review and the webinar recordings from last spring. One, as I mentioned, was about the literature review. The other one was about other research that we've conducted about disabled wildlife viewers in the DARE Human Dimensions Lab. So you can find the recordings there, or you can scan the QR code on your screen if you would like. And again, that link is in the chat, and we'll keep sharing it today because it's where all our stuff is housed. So one of the things that we found in that first phase, that big national survey of wildlife viewers, really jumped out, and that was that 39% of wildlife viewers reported having somewhat, quite a bit, or a great deal of accessibility challenges when they were wildlife viewing. That's a lot of people. That's a huge amount. We know that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, but this is a bigger number than that. So we really wanted to understand, how can we better support these wildlife viewers with disabilities? It's not just important if state wildlife agencies want to be relevant to the community that they serve, and because it's a good thing to do as a human, but there's also several federal laws that make this really important for state wildlife agencies and other nature organisations to be thinking about. One of them is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which has been in existence since the 1970s. And it says that organisations and employers that receive federal funding must not exclude or deny people with disabilities from having an equal opportunity to benefit from programs and services. Another law, another federal law that's been going since the 60s is the Architectural Barriers Act, and it says that all facilities that are designed or altered with federal funds must comply with federal accessibility standards. These standards cover things like parking, building design, bathroom setup, and trails. There are federal standards in the Architectural Barriers Act for accessible hiking trails. And then the third federal law that's really important here is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed in 1990. And part of it says that state wildlife agencies are required to ensure that people with disabilities have equal opportunities to participate in all programs that they offer. And in this context, programs include things like trails and wildlife viewing in general, not just, you know, a bird walk or that kind of a program. So there's several big reasons that state wildlife agencies and other nature organisations should really be paying attention to how we can best serve disabled wildlife viewers.
Thank you for that introduction, everyone. It was really fun to read all of the places you're coming from in the chat today. I'm sorry we can't react to each one individually. Like Ashley said, my name's Emily. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the project and some of our findings, starting with these focus groups, or kind of these group virtual discussions that we held. So as we shared, we focused on talking to wildlife viewers who are disabled or neurodivergent for these focus groups. These participants were recruited through social media, emails, and newsletters, and some direct invites. We conducted this project in collaboration with our steering committee that was chaired by Shelley Plant, with lots of other state agency representatives, many of whom are here today. We held these 8 focus group discussions from July to August of 2024, so last summer. And we spoke to a total of 32 participants, which meant that we had about 3 to 6 participants in each group. And everyone who talked to us got a $50 gift card just to thank them for their time and sharing some insight for us. I'm going to talk a little bit about those demographics of people we spoke to. And the first thing I want to share is the AFWA, or Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, regions that were represented. So these 32 folks were from across the US. There's a couple states, if you're in AFWA, you know Virginia is one of them, where a little bit is in the southeast and a little bit is in the northeast. So those states like Virginia and Texas is another one that are in both regions. We just counted for both because we didn't know exactly where people lived. But we did hear from everyone in all 4 regions, and about at least a quarter from all of them. And to take a look at the gender of our participants, we did hear from a majority of women. We heard from a couple men, as well as some folks who were non-binary or preferred to self-describe their gender. So in terms of their disability type, 66% of folks were neurodivergent. And neurodivergent is a community-generated term, and that means people who kind of process information differently. So this could include people who have autism or ADHD, kind of any of those things kind of classify in with neurodivergent. We also heard from people with lots of disability types. And I want to note these percentages here. You'll see up there chronic illness, it's at about 70%. So participants were able to select all of the disabilities that they identified with. And oftentimes, disability doesn't come in these isolated instances. So maybe someone was neurodivergent and also had a chronic illness. And that's part of why those bars are so high. But to get into specifics, about 70% of respondents said that they had a chronic illness. About 60% of the people we talked to said they had physical challenges or mental health challenges. About 40% of them had some disability related to cognition. And about 30%, or about 1 in 3 of them, had disabilities related to hearing. We heard a little bit less from folks who had challenge with vision, and there were also some other disabilities that people had that didn't fall neatly into any of these categories. And we were also interested in knowing the wildlife viewing behaviors of these participants. If you work on that national survey from the Fish and Wildlife Service, you might be familiar with these items. But we were just interested in how they're participating in wildlife viewing. And a lot of our focus group participants said that they most commonly participated in closely observing or identifying types of wildlife, followed by photographing wildlife. A few of the people we talked to were really avid photographers, so it was really cool to hear from them. We also heard from a lot of people who would take trips or outings to view wildlife. And this means that they would travel to maybe a different location, maybe federal, maybe it was state, to view wildlife beyond just at their home. We also heard from a lot of people who participate in feeding wild birds, about over 40% of them, and a little less from people who maintain plantings or natural areas for the benefit of wildlife. So some of those habitat at home program folks might be interested in that. And then finally, just less than 20% of respondents said that they feed other wildlife. And we were also interested in our focus group participants and understanding if they participate in hunting and fishing, because I know a lot of your duties might overlap with that. About 20% of the people we talked to in those focus groups also participated in fishing, and 6%, which I think was about 1 or 2 people, said they participated in hunting. So we definitely saw more of that overlap with fishing. And to share a little bit about these focus group participants and why they participate in wildlife viewing, we asked them what they liked about wildlife viewing. And one of those big motivations was connection to nature. So wildlife viewing allowed disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers to kind of slow down, connect to nature, feel a little bit of community with the wildlife around them. And people also shared they were really motivated to participate in wildlife viewing from these mental health benefits. People talked about feeling less stressed when they were wildlife viewing, maybe feeling a little bit more grounded or peaceful as well. So now that we have a little bit of understanding of what our focus groups were like and who we talked to, I'm going to share different findings. This is going to take about the majority of the rest of our webinar today. And the first section that I want to focus on is people and groups who supported wildlife viewers who are disabled or neurodivergent. So the people in their lives that provided a lot of support included partners, so maybe people's spouses, as well as their family. So some of the focus group participants we talked to said that they would go wildlife viewing with their adult children, maybe their children would help them drive, or also some of our focus group participants who are younger shared that they would go with their parents. So different family members really helped participating in wildlife viewing, as well as friends were a really big source of social support. And we were also interested in those groups or organizations who supported disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. We heard that nature groups were really important, so some of their local birding chapters could be really helpful. We also heard about identity groups. So these could be groups formed around maybe a certain disability or a certain gender that would bring people together, and they would go on these birding or wildlife viewing trips together. We also heard a lot about state agencies. We just have Virginia here because some of us are based in Virginia, but people shared that their state fish and wildlife agencies were a really important form of support as they participated in wildlife viewing. We also heard a lot about online groups or virtual communities as form of support. This included something some folks call Bird Talk, which is TikTok pages that are about birding, or Facebook pages were really helpful. Some folks mentioned their State Fish and Wildlife Agency's Facebook page for support about wildlife viewing, as well as some smaller, maybe group chats or Discord servers. So what do we mean when we're talking about this type of support? We heard about lots of different support from these people in groups. So these people in groups provided support, one, by scouting wildlife viewing locations. This was a really important finding that a couple different people in the focus groups told us about. Participants said that with their disabilities, they kind of knew what they could or couldn't do, but they weren't sure if a certain site would be accessible to them. So they would send a friend ahead who would check out the trail and let them know if it was something they could or couldn't do. Assistance driving to wildlife viewing locations was also a big form of support. Some of the focus group participants could drive, but some of them couldn't. So they just relied on extra help and transportation to get there. Physical assistance was another form of support that participants received. This included things like carrying heavy equipment for someone or maybe being a steadying hand while someone was walking along a birding trail. Another form of support included this motivation to view wildlife. And this motivation could occur when maybe someone was feeling maybe a little down that day and not really motivated. And a friend or maybe a partner would say, hey, like, let's go outside, let's do a little bit of birding. And that kind of encouragement really helped them get going. And participants also appreciated just having some of these people and especially these groups to go on wildlife viewing outings with. Some of them just really like that group environment and being with people together in nature, as well as access to information. This is the last bullet on this slide, but don't be surprised. This is one of the biggest findings that we had from this project. So you're going to hear a lot more about information from myself and Freya later on. And throughout this presentation, we've got a couple of these quotes that we wanted to share with you. Whenever you see a slide with these little icons in the four corners, that means it's something that one of our participants told us directly. So one participant shared, I have a friend who I led a nature walk with, and they went to the trail beforehand to make sure I could bring my walker. So that's just an example of that scouting support we talked about. A lot of people with disabilities or people who are neurodivergent, they're interested in checking out these new places to view wildlife or lead programs, but they just want to be positive that it's going to be accessible to them. So you might be wondering, what does an accessible wildlife viewing location look like? In this section, we'll just go over features and kind of access at wildlife viewing locations that help make them be more accessible. And the first slide here, because it's really important and we heard about it in all of those groups, is benches. Benches are so important for accessibility. A lot of the people we talked to who were disabled said, I can get to a wildlife viewing location, but I get a little bit fatigued or I need to take a rest. And so having these benches were so important to make sure that people on the trails, they could take a break, maybe they could do some stationary birding, and they could enjoy the trail before continuing on. So with these benches, we heard that it's really important that there's more benches just overall, but also to make sure they have that adequate back support so people can lean on and really rest their whole bodies on, not just kind of those stools or those backless benches. We also heard from some participants who were really interested in what we called bench alternatives. So these were things like picnic tables or really large rocks or boulders or stumps that were along trails that people could still maybe take a sit or just rest against while they're walking or traveling to view wildlife. And you'll recall we conducted these focus groups in the summer, so it was really hot in a lot of places, and we heard that it was really important to think about where benches are, especially in relationship to shade, because having a bench, it's great to rest, but if it's in the hot sun, you might get hot while you're trying to rest. So if benches were placed a little bit more mindfully and in those shaded spaces, could go a really long way. And also wanted to talk about wildlife viewing trails. So in general, we heard from participants that accessible wildlife viewing trails would be those that had firm and stable surfaces. So things that are kind of flat, easy to navigate. What came out in a lot of focus groups were that boardwalks were actually a really great wildlife viewing trails because they've got that flat surface. Normally they're not too unsteady, and it's a really great place to walk along. We also heard a lot about the importance of trail accessibility. So participants shared it's really important to know what's at a trail ahead of time. It could be the case that there's some trails that are near a participant or maybe near a disabled wildlife viewer. And if they're not positive that trail is accessible to them, they won't go through the effort of heading to that trail without that information. Another important feature on wildlife viewing trails that are absent on this graphic is safety barriers. So this could include like railings to rest on or to navigate along. Disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers said they really like these barriers because it was a place to rest their kind of upper body if they felt tired while they were navigating. But it was also great to put your elbows on and hold up your binoculars, which can feel kind of heavy. Another feature at those wildlife viewing trails that we heard were really important included signage. So this included navigational signage. So this could be things like how far to the next bathroom or how far to the next bench, where you are on the trail in relationship to kind of the trailhead or visitor center, as well as just directional signs kind of pointing which way to go, as well as interpretive signage. And we separated these out because some people really appreciated engaging with the environment that they were in from wildlife viewing through lots of different senses and just connecting with the environment. So more interpretive signage, maybe if it has like a cast of an animal or if you have a feather or something that you could put up that people could touch was also a good way to really have this multi-sensory experience at a wildlife viewing location. Just make it a little bit more accessible so more people can appreciate the area. And I wanted to share this quote that someone told us in our focus group about trail information. One participant said, "It helps also just to know what the terrain is. I don't mind walking on gravel or mulch as long as I know what it is ahead of time." So this point or this quote we pulled out because it really drives home this concept of that information is so important just to help people be prepared, maybe know what types of shoes to wear, know if they need to bring a mobility device just to navigate along the trail. We also heard about different amenities or features that people appreciated at wildlife viewing locations. One of them included bathrooms. So having more bathrooms and having accessible bathrooms was something that disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers told us were really important. We also heard about drivable wildlife viewing locations or these kind of wildlife routes that you can take in your car. Some folks shared that they did a lot of wildlife viewing, maybe from their vans or from their cars, and they love these drivable wildlife viewing spots because they could still get out in nature, they could see everything, and they could go different places in a way that was accessible to them. We also heard a lot about the importance of parking, especially kind of mindfully placed accessible parking. One participant shared that there was a time they had kind of driven to a trail and the ADA spot was on the complete opposite side from where the kiosk where you go to pay for park. So maybe thinking about clustering all those important things together could be a great thing for wildlife viewing locations. And we also heard about something that we decided that were called weather mitigation stations. These weather mitigation stations were places where people could get some shade, get some water, and take a little rest. So thinking about shaded locations, maybe those nature centers that have a water fountain and some AC running. Just these features throughout sites that could help if people began to feel hot or maybe needed to cool down, especially in the summertime. With that, I'm going to take a quick sip of my water. Now that we've talked a little bit more about wildlife viewing locations, we're going to shift gears into these wildlife viewing programs that might occur at those wildlife viewing locations. And I hinted at it at the beginning, but this was another area where we really saw that information piece emerge. So when participants talked about accessible wildlife viewing programs, they just said, I want to know all this information ahead of time. So some info to include would be the trail information. So maybe like, what's the material of your trail? Is it steep? Are there any steps? Just kind of a good understanding of what to expect along your trail. Bathroom availability would be great to know ahead of programming. All of these information could be included in like email lists when people sign up or in marketing material. An itinerary of what to expect in the program. So this could include like a really detailed location of where to meet someone. So where does the program start? How long is the program going to be? And what time the program ends? Like we said at the beginning, some folks relied on others for transportation or public transportation. So those really clear start and end times could help people plan their trips to a wildlife viewing program and make sure they could travel back home. The estimated walking distance or travel distance on a wildlife viewing program, so just a ballpark. And really, something we heard was the importance of emphasizing like how far the distance traveled will be and not the time walking, because everybody travels at different paces. And we also heard about the importance of having those places to sit or rest. Some participants shared that they've been to some wildlife viewing programs, but it was just so much standing and they felt really fatigued at the end of it. So they didn't continue participating in programs. So having information available to people about if there's going to be any sitting or resting, or maybe if they could bring like a little portable like camper stool or chair that they could just take with them so they could sit while they're listening to the program leader talking. We also heard a lot about the importance of clearly communicating kind of your target audience, and that includes your group size, so an estimate of how many people will be there, and also making it clear if the program is for adults or kids or different demographics. We heard from some participants who said they went to a wildlife viewing program and it turned out it was a preschool program. So just making sure it's clear who the target audience is. And that piece about group size is also really important. Some folks could feel really anxious or overwhelmed if they were in these really large groups of people without being able to prepare. And so having like a ballpark estimate or maybe doing registration for your program were some things that recommendations we heard from focus group participants that could be really helpful. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about program design, so features to keep in mind when you're planning and running your programs. One thing we heard from focus group participants was about the importance of timing of programs. So some of the people we talked to shared that in the morning they need help from a caregiver who will help them kind of get ready, get showered, and get out for the day. So having a program really early in the morning wasn't as accessible to them. So sometimes programs that were later in the day or maybe on different days could be helpful, as well as thinking about the season and the weather patterns. We conducted these focus groups in the summer, so in the heat of the day under the sun might not be a great time for folks, but kind of on the other side, if you're thinking about winter programming, maybe not having your programs too late when it's already dark, it might be harder to drive home. Another thing we heard from focus group participants was about the importance of using multiple formats for sharing information. So some folks shared that they had a little bit of a tough time processing auditory information. So if someone was just talking at them, like I am now, it was a little harder for them to follow. But using multiple formats for sharing information, so in this case, we have slides, but maybe having handouts or pictures or diagrams or specimens, were all ways that your programs could connect a little bit more with people and help them really kind of get those key messages. Another really big recommendation or kind of theme we heard from focus group participants was the importance of moving slowly. Somebody shared that they had tried to go to a wildlife viewing program and they were a little slower because of a mobility challenge, and the group just left them behind. So making sure if you're leading programs to move slowly, keep an eye on everybody, and have breaks for programs. This was especially important thinking about those rest areas. So with wildlife viewing locations, we talked about benches, but just having those breaks, if you're having breaks, maybe having and talking, maybe doing that against a railing or something where people could kind of lean or sit down while they're hearing information. And another recommendation for program design was having loaner equipment. Disability is really expensive, and sometimes adaptable equipment can be even more expensive. So if you're leading a program, especially for beginners, maybe having like extra binoculars if you have some, maybe having umbrellas if it's going to be really hot or rainy. And so thinking about if there's any equipment that you could provide at your program, just so people could loan it while they're there, could help make those programs more inclusive. And I wanted to share this quote about moving slowly from a focus group participant who also led their own accessible wildlife viewing programs. And one person shared with us, when I lead my groups, I 100% plan my walk. We don't call them hikes for the person who is the slowest one in the group. I don't say that to them. I say no one will be left behind. So when you're thinking about planning your groups, really making sure that you're moving slowly. If that means maybe you have to cut a step on your nature walk or maybe remove a location, we heard it was really important just to match pace with everyone there and make sure that nobody gets left behind. There were a couple other program considerations. We heard from disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. One that I kind of hinted at a little bit would be to consider transportation options. So maybe having your programs near public transportation or carpooling if you're able, and communicating that on info before your program, as well as virtual programming. We heard from some folks who really liked virtual programming. They said that I can't always navigate to every site, and having a virtual program or maybe having some videos of programs or those live streams, that's a great way for me to kind of connect to nature and do some wildlife viewing at a site that I wouldn't have been able to experience otherwise. And another important program consideration we heard was just the attitudes of others. And this is something that my colleague Freya will dive more into with her sections. And I wanted to close this discussion on wildlife viewing programs to just share why some people aren't participating in wildlife viewing programs. Some folks shared with us that they felt really unwelcome. Maybe they had tried to go to a wildlife viewing program and nobody really said hi, people weren't friendly, they felt like they were kind of the outsider on a group. So that was one thing that led people to not participate. We also heard from some who were just hesitant to participate in programs. They were worried that the program wouldn't be accessible to them, and they didn't want to kind of pull people back. And that was another kind of big finding that we heard from these focus groups, was the perceptions of programs being inaccessible. People just kind of assumed, oh, a wildlife viewing program might not be for me. That doesn't sound like something that would be accessible. And we also heard from some people who just lacked awareness of programs. When we asked these questions about participating in wildlife viewing programs, some folks said, oh, wow, I had no idea that was a thing, or I didn't know that was in my area. I'll have to check it out and maybe go on one in the future. So again, just awareness and maybe thinking about how you advertise or promote programs could be one barrier as well. And one quote that we heard from someone about no participation, someone did share with us, I haven't participated in a program like that before either. I was always worried that they wouldn't be accessible for me. All right. And with that, I will pass things off to my colleague Freya, who's going to share information about being an ally to disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers.
Thanks so much, Emily. All right, here comes my screen. So on this slide is a photo of a trail, and it sort of ends at stairs going down into the forest, and there's a sign that says, just before the stairs go down, attention, for 94 steps to brink. And as you've heard, hearing information about programs and trails is a really important thing for disabled wildlife viewers. So we're going to dive into this part of the focus groups. We asked, what can individuals do to be allies to disabled wildlife viewers, and how can agencies and organisations demonstrate their allyship as well? So those answers are all sort of mixed up here, and some of them you've already heard, which really just tell me that they're quite important. So just in case you're wondering, allyship is actively and intentionally supporting, uplifting, and advocating for a personal group that you do not belong to, often using your privilege to help dismantle systems of oppression and promote social change. And if you are a staff member or you volunteer at a state wildlife agency or a nature organization, you might have some of that privilege because you might have a bit more of a voice in decisions that are being made. And so there's an opportunity there to be an ally. So a big thing that staff, volunteers and other wildlife viewers were requested to do was just to be kind. This involved being patient if people were slower to communicate or needed something repeated or were walking or moving slowly. Not to stare. You would think that that's maybe basic politeness, but this came up several times that people who moved differently or spoke differently, communicated differently were getting stared at by other people. They didn't really like that. So best to avoid. Avoiding being patronizing too, talking down to someone, assuming they don't know something or assuming they don't know how their own body works and what their own access needs are. As well as not talking about someone in front of them. Again, this sounds kind of basic, but it came up. This was happening quite a bit. We also want folks, the participants of focus groups wanted to be welcomed as they are, just as they show up. Hey, it's really great to have you here. You know, welcome to this program. And to be treated like they're normal people, not to be overprotected or anything like that. Just be kind. One participant shared, some of the people that lead the events don't have patience. They expect you to keep up with them and go at their pace and pay attention to exactly what they're saying at the moment. And sometimes we're not capable of doing that. So being patient was a way around that maybe not ideal experience that this person was having. Another thing that came up was not to make assumptions. Participants of our focus groups wanted staff, volunteers and other wildlife viewers to stop making judgment calls about them. And there were several ways that these judgment calls were being made. One was generally just being judgy. One was to avoid assuming someone's access or support needs. So just because someone looks a certain way or moves a certain way or communicates in a certain way, you don't automatically know what assistance they might benefit from or how best to offer that assistance. So not making that assumption. Another thing that they wanted folks to avoid was making assumptions about their birding or wildlife viewing skill or interest level. Again, just because they move a certain way or communicate a certain way or think a certain way doesn't mean that they're brand new or nervous. They might be really, really, really good and they might be really dialed into wildlife viewing or birding, which came up sort of a lot of people evidently were birders in our focus groups, just because we shouldn't assume. One participant shared, just because two people have the same diagnosis doesn't mean they have the same disabilities or accommodation or access needs. Another one said, they see somebody in a wheelchair and they freak out, like, oh my God, how are we going to make this work? This person was a wheelchair user and they were talking about showing up at a wildlife viewing program. Evidently, these folks that were present at the program were making an assumption that this person needed a certain amount of support or needed a certain kind of trail or had a certain kinds of support access needs. And again, they definitely wanted folks to not do that. So they actually shared a whole lot of ways that we can counteract these assumptions that we might be making. One of them was to assume that disability is present. And as we already talked about, 39% of wildlife viewers reported experiencing quite a bit or a great deal of accessibility challenges. So if you're designing a trail or a visitor centre or leading a program, just assume that people with disabilities will show up. Really important was to appreciate the breadth of disability. Disability is, there's a lot of different people with a lot of different disability types and a lot of different support needs who are disabled and who will benefit from your understanding that disability is really broad. Presuming competence was important to focus group participants, not assuming that someone couldn't do something, instead starting from probably they can, let's find out more. And so you can invite sharing of access needs. This was suggested in registration forms. You can ask, do you have any access needs, or at the start of a program, and people who want to let you know that will let you know that. Participants also suggested offering practical assistance. So if someone's access need is, I have a lot of pain in my back and my hips, so I'm going to need to go really slowly on this bird walk. Practical assistance could be something like, oh, well, hey, we actually have a loaner all-terrain wheelchair. Would you like to borrow it for the day? Like some practical thing, not just like, how can I help you? Because that's sort of broad and a bit ambiguous, but some specific practical assistance. And then you can ask open-ended questions too, and go back and forwards between them, letting the person be the guide about what they need. One participant said, disability means more than just wheelchair user, and you can't always tell just by looking at someone if they have a disability. With the large spectrum of disabilities comes a large array of access needs, and accessibility is not simply or necessarily a paved path. Normalising disability was really important to focus group participants. And on this slide, there's a little image of a penguin with a little love heart and sunglasses, because this penguin is being very cool about disability. So instead of acting like disability isn't there, participants wanted folks to support the use of adaptive equipment like hiking poles, or using the Merlin Bird ID app to help them identify bird sounds, and service dogs. Service dogs, by the way, side note, are legally protected in the US thanks to the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're not the same as pets, but this came up several times that other wildlife viewers were making assumptions about someone who had a service dog, who needed their service dog to be out there on the trail, and other people were being rude or dismissive or passive aggressive about them having their pet with them. And it's not a pet, it's a service dog. So supporting the use of these things, and having a reliable and informed contact person who folks could ring or email to ask about accessibility information for all programs and trails. This was quite important to folks because that information about these things the lack of information is a really big barrier that came up over and over again. Another thing that you can do to normalise disability is use up-to-date disability-related language. Like the rest of English, disability-related language is always evolving, and it's really easy to do this because you can just Google, disability best practice language guides. We have several of them linked in that literature review that I mentioned at the top of this presentation. So if you'd like to get our favorite ones, you can do that through our literature review. One participant in the focus groups shared, I haven't participated in a wildlife viewing program like that before. I've always been worried that they wouldn't be accessible for me. I've never really felt welcome. I never really felt like I could reach out and inquire further about accessibility information. So there's two easy ways to counteract that, right? Providing that information and having that reliable and informed contact person available. Emily mentioned this, but this is an act of allyship too. We can normalise access needs in wildlife viewing programs. So instead of acting like disability isn't there, we can provide that accessibility information in program descriptions and at the start of programs when speaking to the group. And we can incorporate rest breaks. You heard that a lot already. Rest is really important for people with chronic fatigue, chronic pain, bad knees, a whole lot of different things going on. Communicate in multiple formats, and being neurodivergent affirming. If that phrase isn't familiar to you, you heard Emily define neurodivergent earlier. Lots of folks who are neurodivergent process information differently, have different ways of engaging with people, might move or speak differently than the neurotypical ways of doing things. And being neurodivergent affirming is about supporting and celebrating, or just not really worrying about the different ways that someone might be engaging with the world around them, as long as it's safe, like just being cool with that. There are some really specific, really valuable insights about how people can be neurodivergent affirming. So if you get hold of our report that we mentioned at the top, there in one of the appendices is all these different strategies that focus group participants mentioned about how we can be neurodivergent affirming. So do check that out. Focus group participants also wanted agencies and organisations to normalise disability. So there's several ways they suggested of doing this. One was for designing for accessibility right from the beginning, designing trails, designing visitor centres, designing programs, building it for accessibility from the ground up. Educating the public about disability was important and how to be an ally. So, for example, signs that explained the legal differences between pets and service animals at wildlife viewing locations was an example that a participant gave of how an agency could educate the public about disability and how to be an ally. Hire and support disabled people was important. When disabled people are in the room, different decisions get made and maybe things will be designed for accessibility from the beginning. This also mattered to participants because representation mattered to them too. So seeing staff and volunteers who had disabilities or who talked about having disabilities, and seeing disabled people in marketing materials genuinely, not a stock photo that someone just got off the internet, but actual images of actual disabled wildlife viewers out there enjoying themselves was really important to focus group participants. You've heard this before, and we're drilling it home today because this was by far, the most overwhelming thing we heard in these focus groups was providing information about trails and programs. It needs to be accurate, it needs to be detailed, it needs to be objective, so not an opinion like medium difficulty trail, but actually tell us what specifically about it makes you think it's medium difficulty, like the surface or the gradient. About all the trails and all the programs when sharing about these online, on websites, on social media, on maps, at trailheads, and in marketing materials. That accurate thing too was important. Participants mentioned showing up at a trail and finding out a log had fallen over the trail and they couldn't get over or around it, or branches coming down, or trails getting damaged. So accurate information is important, being transparent, not just trying to paint your trail in the best possible light if that's not really the reality. So there's a photo on the slide of a sign that has the international symbol of accessibility, that stick figure wheelchair user, and a stick figure hiking person, and it says accessible trail on the sign. Great, not that helpful. We need more information than that. That's what the participants were telling us. We need to see signs that look more like this. This photo was taken at the Echo River Spring Trail, which is at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, if you're interested. And it has really detailed information about the trail length, the surface types, the width of the trail, particularly important for folks using mobility devices, the grade or the steepness, both the average and the maximum, so people know what they're coming up against, and the cross slope. And cross slope is how much of an angle you're on as you're traveling down that trail. And again, that's particularly important for folks using mobility devices or who have balance issues. Falling over is a really bad outcome in those situations. And so people want to know if the trail's on a funky angle or if it's going to stay nice and flat in that direction as well. A focus group participant said, someone mentioned an owl prowl. I would absolutely love to go on something like that, but I'm going to guess it's not wheelchair accessible. There was never any mention of it. You know, if it could be, this is a paved trail, this is through the woods, this is, moderate difficulty. Maybe this person would show up at this program if they knew what was coming. Promoting different methods of wildlife viewing was a way that agencies and individuals could be allies to disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. There's an image here of someone seated on a bench with binoculars sitting next to them. You've heard about benches. They wanted to have wildlife viewing programs at different times of the day and on different days of the week. The time of the day, as Emily mentioned, is really important. There's this conventional wisdom that, the best birding happens at first light. But as Emily mentioned, lots of people can't show up at first light for a variety of reasons that often are completely beyond their control, not just that they'd rather sleep in. So having programs later in the day or in the afternoon. People mentioned evening programs when it's a bit cooler, maybe after work. We're going to make them more doable for these folks. Promoting participatory science opportunities came up several times. People getting really excited about hearing about iNaturalist BioBlitzes or the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Big Day. There were lots of different ways that these participatory science opportunities got people excited to show up, got them out the door, gave them a reason to get out wildlife viewing. So just sharing that these events are coming up is a way of supporting disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. You've heard about benches already. They're promoting those opportunities for stationary wildlife viewing, benches, observation towers and bird blinds, things like that, where people can sit down and stay in one place. They don't have to worry about that trail. They don't have to worry about having pain from walking. They can enjoy the experience from one spot. Various styles of wildlife viewing exist, and so creating programs and suggesting engaging in these different ways was something that was important to focus group participants. Things like Emily mentioned having auto routes in refuges, or stationary viewing opportunities as a program, a stationary wildlife viewing program, or virtual programs. There's so many different ways that agencies can support different styles of wildlife viewing. And finally, offering loaner adaptive equipment came up several times. Not everyone can afford binoculars, not everyone can use binoculars, so maybe monoculars or having a scope available, having all-terrain wheelchairs or beach wheelchairs available, having a camp stool that folds up and is light and someone can carry with them during a program. Lots of different types of adaptive equipment that agencies and organisations can potentially provide to disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. Being genuine was a really important thing to our focus group participants. So the big part of this was avoiding tokenism or performative actions. Tokenism is this idea of doing something once and saying, yep, we did it, check that box, done, yep, and never engaging again. Participants did not want that happening, and performative actions are things that really just make you or your agency or organization look really good, but aren't really useful or impactful in the right ways. So it was very clear in our conversations in these focus groups that participants were very attuned to these sorts of actions and behaviours, and it really was a big kind of turn off for engaging with that person or that organisation again. So if you want to know specifically what those actions might look like, there's another appendix in our report that goes through everything that our focus group participants mentioned that fell into this category of tokenism or performative actions. So have a look at that and try and avoid them. They also really wanted agencies to go beyond minimum accessibility standards. You may have heard of the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. There's also standards for accessible trails, and they said over and over again, these are the minimum standards. They're not the best, they're just the minimum. Go beyond that, keep going, there's more to it than that. So that was an act of being genuine in trying to design for accessibility. Maintaining accessible features. I saw someone in the chat mention this about, I think it was about benches or boardwalks. Things out in nature change. Trees fall down, trails flood, boardwalks crack, things change. And participants mentioned that if the energy and the money had been spent designing and building these accessible features, it seemed a real shame if they weren't maintained. They weren't usable anymore. They were no longer accessible sometimes. So maintaining those accessible features. They also suggested, participants also suggested having a really easy way of giving feedback about something that wasn't accessible anymore or could be improved, and having perhaps a specific little pot of money in the budget for that location, that park or refuge, that could be used just for those quick fixes, like replacing one board on a boardwalk or replacing the hinge on the accessible stall in the bathroom that isn't working properly, and so the accessible stall's not usable. So there were some pretty good ideas that could be easily implemented, perhaps. And that falls into that this idea of implementing simple improvements quickly, having a quick, easy feedback method, and being able to action that feedback, within a day, a week, 2 weeks, a month, instead of it going at the bottom of a queue that's going to take 2 years to get to. If they were quick and easy improvements, then just getting on with it would make things a lot easier for these disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. So I sort of defined tokenism and performative actions when I mentioned it, but here are the words from focus group participants. One said that performative actions are more to make themselves look better than it is to actually help people. And another one said they invite a disabled person on so they can say, we have a disabled person on our board. For the record, we're really inclusive, but it may not mean anything other than words. Again, have a look in our report if you'd like more examples of what performative actions or tokenism could look like. It was also really important to disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers who we talked to collaborate respectfully. So one question that we asked in this discussion was, if an agency reached out to you and wanted to work with you to lead a program or run a training or something, what would be like a red flag? And we got some really important answers about what collaborating respectfully looks like. One was to be transparent when reaching out, sharing exactly what you're asking the person to do, how long you think it will take, when it needs to be done by. Is there an honorarium and what is that? That was really important because it was also really important to not expect free labour. It was made very clear by participants that their time, like everyone's time, is valuable. It's not infinite. And if their expertise was worth asking for, it was also worth paying for. As Emily mentioned, our focus group participants received a $50 gift card for participating in a 90-minute focus group. It's not very much, but it's something, some kind of acknowledgement that their input is really important. Participants also wanted agencies to consult early and often with disabled wildlife viewers, and not just one wildlife viewers with one particular disability type, but with a variety of disabled people's input, because as we said before, disability is very broad and everyone has different access needs. So bringing folks in from the beginning and again during design or redesign or program planning was really important. And finally, as an act of allyship, staying humble and continuing to learn was really important to our focus group participants. So providing staff and volunteer training frequently, make it mandatory, we heard, run by people with disabilities who actually have that lived experience, who can talk more genuinely about this stuff. If you would like some examples of the types of training topics you might seek, there's another appendix in our report that lists all those training topics that our focus group participants mentioned. There's quite a lot, by the way, so it should keep you busy for a while. Staying flexible was important. Disability changes, things change, preferences change. Keeping an open mind was an important thing. Supporting broader social justice efforts mattered. Disabled folks aren't all white, straight and cisgender. There's lots of Black, Indigenous and people of colour who are disabled, and queer folks who are disabled, women who are disabled. And so working not in a silo was important for folks to see agencies and other individuals doing if they wanted to be seen as allies. And don't assume you know all the answers. This was quite a big one too. That's the staying humble thing. That disability is really broad. There's a lot going on here, and so coming with the opportunity, with a learner's mind, being willing to have the community lead the way and share their experience was really important to these folks. And I'll leave you at the end of this big conversation about allyship with this quote. One of the participants said, "You have to be dynamic about it because disability is dynamic. Not all of us are just wheelchair users or born with limb difference. A lot of us come into disability at different times. People who might need your help might not identify as disabled yet. it is helpful to offer things and to try to know the answers, but don't assume you have all the answers because it would be an impossibly long handbook. And I took that as really encouraging. You don't have to be an expert. In fact, our participants didn't want you to pretend to be an expert. Come willing to learn and listen to the community that you're trying to serve. So, because that was quite a lot, just a quick summary of the allyship findings that participants shared with us. Be kind and patient, don't make assumptions, presume competence, normalize disability and normalize access needs, we all have them, provide detailed, concrete information about all programs and all trails, promote different methods of wildlife viewing, avoid tokenism or performative actions, collaborate early and often with a variety of disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers, and stay humble and keep learning. Like all the things we've talked about today, there's more detail about all of this in our report. So please do have a look at that and share it with whoever you like. That's what it's there for. It's there to be used. That's why we've been doing this work. So please dig into that report. There's also handouts on our website that you can download to use in trainings or to share with staff or volunteers. There's a handout about programs, about wildlife viewing locations, and about allyship. So please use them if they'll be of value to you. So after we conducted these focus groups, Emily and I spent quite a long time going through the transcripts and analysing them. We've shared you a lot of those findings. And then we hosted a co-production workshop with a bunch of staff members at different state wildlife agencies. And collectively, we've come up with 5 recommendations based on what we heard from participants in our focus groups about what state agencies and nature organisations can do to best support disabled wildlife viewers. On this slide is a photo of a person using a mobility scooter heading down a trail in a wildlife viewing location. The first recommendation, perhaps not a surprise, is to share detailed accessibility information for all your trails and programs. This was by far, absolutely by far, the most requested change that could be made. And in fact, it doesn't really necessarily cost any money, just some time. It needs to be detailed, specific, up to date, and pictures and descriptions and videos were suggested because they can be really helpful for folks too, to have a really good understanding about the barriers that might be present or the shade situation or just to understand more about that location or that upcoming program. It was also reinforced to us by participants that all trails needed this information, not just the ones that were considered accessible by some standard, because everyone has different access needs. And there are plenty of folks who might want a little bit more of a challenge than a flat half-mile concrete trail. But if there isn't that detailed information about trails that are sort of the next level of difficulty up, they might not realise that that's something that they could tackle too. The second recommendation that came out of these focus groups in our co-production workshop was to improve inclusion in wildlife viewing programs. And there's several ways that this could be done. One was through training. And as I mentioned earlier, ideas for training topics that were brought up by participants are in the report. Don't forget that training should be run, per the participants, by disabled folks too. Checklists could be useful to help interpreters and educators, program leaders incorporate some of these recommendations. I mentioned handouts just a minute ago on our website that are there for you to use. There are checklists in those handouts. There's a checklist for the information that participants told us they wanted to know ahead of time about wildlife viewing programs. And there's another checklist about the information participants wanted to know about trails. So please get hold of those and use them. That's what they're there for. And another way to improve inclusion that came out of these focus groups was to do a bit more intentional incorporating of multiple senses. We humans are so driven by vision. We're very dominant in our prioritizing sight, but so many folks wanted more emphasis on, say, birding by ear or more engagement with touch and smell and other senses that we have. So pulling these all in as often as you can into wildlife viewing programs. The third recommendation is to improve the accessibility at wildlife viewing locations. We've covered a whole lot of ways today that participants wanted that to happen. Well-placed benches was absolutely the most requested access feature at wildlife viewing locations. As Emily mentioned, with the backrest in the shade, being thoughtful about where these benches are placed, not just kind of throwing them around. Firm and stable trails came up over and over again. Safety barriers with handrails for people to lean on, for them to get their balance on, people to rest against. Shade was really important. There's many types of chronic illnesses and chronic health conditions where overheating makes things really much worse in your body. So shade was everyone benefits from shade, but shade was really important to folks in our focus groups. And there's more details about all of this in the report. So again, please go check out that report. The fourth recommendation is to provide ongoing training, especially about allyship, because it's complex. And there's lots of this idea of being an ally, working with, not for people, might be new to staff and volunteers, and these alternative approaches to working with others might be needed. There might need to be a bit of a shift in the way things have been done before to really get this going within an organisation. Repetition of the concepts around allyship and expanding on these topics over time is valuable, and that big list of training topics in the report might help you expand over time too. And again, this training should be provided by disabled educators. And finally, the fifth recommendation that came out of this work was to secure funding and collaborate widely. So some of these changes might be at very low cost, maybe like providing detailed information. They might just need staff or volunteer time, but other improvements might definitely require money. And so getting hold of funding in order to implement these recommendations is going to be important if you want to do that. And engaging effectively with other nature and disability organisations will help increase agency relevancy. There's several examples of this in the report. And don't forget those collaborating respectfully and those other concepts around allyship will be really important if you're reaching out to disability organisations. So this webinar and publishing this report was the final step in this particular grant, but we have another multi-state conservation grant and we're continuing on with this work because there's quite a bit more to do. So this year, Emily's heading off with a PhD, and I will be working on case studies to support state wildlife agencies and other nature organisations to better support disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers, because there's lots of great work that is happening. There's lots of really great accessible trails and loaner adaptive equipment programs, but lots of states and other organisations don't know about what those programs look like or how to implement one themselves in their own state or in their own organisation. So these detailed case studies I'm doing a whole lot of interviews with staff and with disabled users and participants of these programs, collecting documentation. I'll be writing detailed reports and delivering more webinars to share what was done and how to replicate that easily so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel and start from the beginning, because lots of organizations, lots of state wildlife agencies may only have one person whose responsibility is wildlife viewing, or they may only have one person whose responsibility is accessibility, and it's a lot on their plate. So this is an effort to support more organizations doing more of this great work. So these case studies, there'll be 4 of them. One will be about an accessible wildlife viewing trail. One will be about an inclusive wildlife viewing program. One will be about ongoing engagement with the disability community, what that looks like and how to do that yourself. And one will be about an adaptive equipment loaner program. And each of these case studies will be written up in a detailed report, will be shared as a webinar. Both of those things will be announced to our email list, and then they will be available for anyone to get hold of on our Wildlife Viewing Toolkit website. That's the one we keep sharing the link in the chat today. And I'll be presenting at 3 conferences about these too, just trying to get the word out because, again, these are being created for your benefit to support disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers. So we want people to know about them. Okay. As a reminder, today's webinar was all about the findings that we are sharing in this big detailed report called Supporting Participation of Disabled Wildlife Viewers, Recommendations from Focus Groups. Please get hold of that through our Wildlife Viewing Toolkit. It is there for you to use, download, share. We'd love to hear if you find it helpful, and you can tell us about that via email. So if you would like, speaking of emails, if you would like to hear about the next report, the case study reports and the webinars, you can sign up for our email list. We will put that link in the chat. You can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can visit tinyurl.com/Daya Lab Disability email list. You'll only get maybe 8 emails a year at most when I have something to share with you, like these reports and webinars. You can also share or ask any questions you like. My email address is Freya, that's Freya McGregor, or one word, McGregor @vt.edu. And Ashley's email address is Dayer, Dayer @vt.edu. Happy to hear from you, especially if you find this report helpful and you're using it. We definitely love to hear about that. And don't forget, all of these things can be found on our website at viewing.fishwild, one word, .vt.edu, and then click on the Disabled Wildlife Viewers tab at the top. Once again, this project was funded by the US Fish and Wildlife Services Multistate Conservation Grant Program, which is jointly managed by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the US Fish and Wildlife Services Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. Thank you very much for being here. I've seen the chat popping up as I've been speaking, so we definitely have time for quite a few questions. And I think Ashley will be leading the questions for us. So thanks again for being here, and let's jump into questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Freya. Maybe you can, take off that. That would be awesome. Wanted to quickly call out a couple of things. First, thank you so much, Emily and Freya, for that presentation. It was great to see all of the findings coming together there. Also, I wanted to call out that I was interested to see so many individual comments that came to us as hosts and panelists from folks saying that they have personal experience with disability and how useful these findings are and how much it resonated with them. And I don't just say that to like pat ourselves on the back, but also to remind folks that you never know who could benefit from these sorts of adaptations that you can make at your site. So just a reminder that there's individuals everywhere you go and everywhere you work that could really benefit from these sorts of changes or adaptations to the work that you're doing. A reminder that we'd really like to hear your feedback on this presentation before you leave today. So Emily put a link in the chat. It's just a few quick questions, very short for social scientists. It's helpful to us to know not only what resonated with you from the presentation or how we could improve the presentation, but also your thoughts on how this might be useful to you in your work. We need to report back on that to our funder, and it also helps inform our future work. So please do add your thoughts there before you wrap up. Okay, so again, we welcome any questions in the chat. I have one for Emily and Freya. You all can decide who jumps on it first. But what do sites do if they don't have much money? How do they decide how to navigate the report and know where to start if they don't have funding pot for disability accessibility related work?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ashley. I can start with this. In our recommendation section of the report, we actually organized the recommendations with 3 different scales of dollar signs. So there's more dollar signs or $3 signs for those bigger ticket items. But some of the $1 sign items that are just information, or some of those smaller things could be a great place to start. And for places that are really constrained by budgets, I think the most important thing to do is to just raise this type of awareness with your staff and all of your volunteers. So I know summer seasonals might be coming on. Maybe you could just send them this recording. The report's available online. So just getting that information and getting it on radars might be a really good first step. And I'll pass it to you, Freya.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind is that anything you do to increase accessibility increases accessibility. So you might not have the budget or the resources to design a whole new 3-mile wonderfully accessible trail, but adding one thoughtfully placed bench increases accessibility for folks. Maybe they can get just that much further down that trail now because they can have a rest along the way. So it doesn't have to be huge to be impactful. Start somewhere and build from there. Don't even though this might have felt like a whole tidal wave of information about all the things you could do, just starting somewhere is more important than freezing and not doing anything at all.
Great, thanks so much, Freya and Emily. Another question that came up in the chat is we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that some of us have personal experience with accessibility challenges. And is anyone in the group willing to talk about accessibility challenges they've faced and personal adaptations that have been helpful to them? And I can start. I identify as being neurodivergent as well as having neurodivergent children, and that neurodivergence looks different amongst my kids and myself. For some of us, it's ADHD and hyperactivity. And so for us, having a slow outing or a quiet outing doesn't work very well for us. So it's helpful to know if it's the pace of opportunities that are available because that hyperactivity comes out and the desire to be social comes out. So knowing how that program is going to be played out. And then for another family member, that child is on the autism spectrum, and he really needs to be able to have accessible bathrooms that are single stall and don't have the loud noises of all the other stalls. So finding locations for us is really important where there are those single stall bathrooms. So those are just a couple of things that play out for our family. Anyone else want to share anything?
Yeah, sure. So I have a dodgy knee. I call it that because it took 3 years to get a diagnosis. It's chondromalacia, if you're interested. You can Google that. There's fissuring in the back of my kneecap, and after several years of intense rehabilitation, I'm doing a lot better now, but it causes quite a lot of pain. Standing is a lot harder for me than walking, and standing on hard surfaces like concrete and asphalt is harder than squishier surfaces like grass. But then walking on grass is more challenging because it's more uneven, and so my knee has to do more work. So benches are huge for me. Being able to sit, a lot of people talk about seeing more birds and more wildlife when they sit still in one place. And I certainly learned that when I couldn't walk more than half a mile without a lot of pain in my knee. The other thing too, that information, that photo that I shared of the Echo River Spring Trail, that was the first time I'd ever seen information in that level of detail on a sign. And that having that information is the reason that I continued beyond the concrete trail that day, trying to test out if my knee could do a little bit more than I thought. And it turned out that it could, and it was really exciting. And so so the 2 biggest findings from this were detailed information and benches, and that reflects my experiences too of being a disabled wildlife viewer. My husband lives with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He's a combat veteran, and he has a bunch of other access needs, like Ashley mentioned. Big groups are uncomfortable, smaller groups, understanding where things are. Binoculars are uncomfortable for him because it reduces his peripheral vision, so he likes a monocular better because he can keep his other eye open and just be aware of what's coming at him out there in the world. So yeah, it's very likely that there are lots of people you know who have these access needs. They might not identify as disabled, but these access needs that do impact how they go wildlife viewing. A lot of this work, we often think it benefits only one group of people, but very, very often it benefits a whole lot more people than you think.
Yeah, I think that resonates with a comment that I see in the chat, and just a reminder to all of you, especially as you're being asked to make sure that your programs are not just serving a single group, but accessible to all, that these sorts of adaptations for disability are a great way to make your program accessible to all sorts of people. It could be pregnant people, it could be people who have strollers with their children along for the ride. It could be people who've been recently injured and are healing from an injury or from a surgery. All of those are groups of people who may not be permanently disabled, but may need these accessibility adaptations at various times. All right. Any other questions? Yes, and someone else is bringing up an aging population. That's certainly the case too. That's when many folks learn that they need more accessibility modifications as well. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here. Emily, Freya, Shelley, any last things that you want to say before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining us. We're recording it now and this will be available and just on YouTube. So feel free to share it in the report as well. And we really emphasize those handouts, but they're colorful. There's little checklists. The report's like 60 pages long, but if you don't have a lot of time, get to those handouts and they'll kind of tell you those big takeaways. And please use them and share them as you see fit.
All right. Thanks, everybody, so much for joining our webinar today to learn about the findings of our work. We look forward to continuing to stay in touch with you. Take care.
Thank you.